Right, so it is tonight that the new documentary on Hitler's presumptive DNA is to be aired for the first time. So they claim to have isolated Hitler's DNA from a scrap of the sofa upon which he shot himself in 1945. This scrap of cloth from the sofa having been taken as a souvenir by a GI. Apparently there are bloodstains on it. So yeah, apparently that's their claim, that they have isolated this DNA. So it still has to be examined. But anyway, it's going to air tonight. So I thought I would make a few arguments relative to Hitler, because I got takes. Boy, do I got takes. So the first thing that I wanted to say was that I think that Hitler's central theoretical error, his central, if you like, race philosophical error, was his massive underestimation, catastrophic underestimation of the Slavs. Okay, he had no excuse for making that error, because both of his main teachers in racial philosophy, Gobineau and Chamberlain, had both told him that the Slavs were to be regarded as full Aryans, even if they didn't quite use that terminology, right? Certainly, Chamberlain saw the Celts, Germanics and Slavs as full Aryans equally, and Gobineau too saw the Slavs as, northern people who had retained their whiteness, right? Unlike other groups which had become mixed. I'm not saying that everything in those race theorists was true, of course it wasn't. We have far more advanced race science today, in spite of liberal democracy. But the fact is that, Hitler had no excuse for making this catastrophic underestimation of the Slavs. So why did he make such a catastrophic underestimation of them? Well, the reason is that he made a false generalization from his experience of Slavs from his period in Vienna. Okay, so when Hitler was in Vienna, it was quite a humiliating time for his life, of course. He hadn't been able to find success or fit in anywhere, and this was clearly demoralizing for him. And he had experiences, right, at the bottom of society in Vienna, sleeping in flop houses and so on, of other people at the bottom of Viennese society, and many of them were Slavs. Okay, many of them were poor, semi-literate immigrants from places like Galicia or Bohemia, so Czechs, Slovaks, Poles. Okay, now of course we know that these guys, these migrant workers, were in economically disadvantaged people who were perfectly good people, right? But you've got to understand, from Hitler's point of view, being sort of déclassé as he was, having fallen on hard times, they seemed crude and brutish to him. And so he made a false generalization of that experience from his down and out period in Vienna to Slavs in general. And there's a very interesting fact I remember reading in the Kershaw biography. Hitler made a visit to the Wolfschanze during the war against Russia. The Wolfschanze being a forward point, near the front lines on the Eastern Front. Hitler visited the Wolfschanze and he saw some Russians, right? And the Russians that he saw belonged to the racial type which Hitler tended to esteem highly. For whether he was right or not is another matter. But Hitler saw these Russians, and apparently, according to the Kershaw biography, it shook his racial ideas. He was so impressed by the physicality of these Russians that he doubted, for at least a moment, that his take on Slavs might have been wrong. And indeed it was wrong. And indeed it was catastrophically wrong. And indeed the Russians proved that it was wrong. And indeed the Russians today are going to prove it again. The West might actually make the same mistake that Hitler made in underestimating the Russians again. Because, the West likes crowing about how unsuccessful the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine was. But boy, give the Russians a couple of years to get going, they might make a false start. But you remember what happened from 1942 onwards. So yeah, that is the first take that I want to give relating to Hitler. It's not an original take, but it is a very important, fundamentally important one, Hitler's fundamental race philosophical error was his massive underestimation of the Slavs. And Westerners now, whether they're liberal Democrats like the people underestimating the Russians in Ukraine, or whether they are radical rightists, need to learn the lesson of Hitler's mistake and bloody well respect the Slavs. Second point that I would like to make on Hitler, connected to his underestimation of the Slavs, was his catastrophic foreign policy. His foreign policy vis-a-vis both West and East was absolutely insane, and again, just tragically catastrophic, right? Hitler thought that he could take on the whole world alone, didn't he? He thought that he could wipe out the Slavs, and then once he controlled pretty much the whole continent, continent of Europe, then he would be in far too strong a position vis-a-vis the Anglophone powers for them to defeat him in war. But it's not only his attitude towards the East that was wrong, it's his attitude towards the West. He was in a very good position, actually, in his position vis-a-vis the Western powers, because they shared some pretty fundamental positions. It was not only the German National Socialists in the 1930s who were race realists. The Western powers were too. The Americans were race realists then. So were the Brits. So were the French. Okay, that's not hard. It's not hard to prove that. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Churchill's attitudes on race. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with Russell's attitudes on race. Right? This was standard. There was no taboo against facing up to race in 1930s Europe. The British and the Americans and the French were every bit as bloody racist as the National Socialists, right? They had race realism in common as a common foundation on which to build, an alliance. If Hitler had adopted a sound diplomacy, the Brits and the French were trying to hold down the lower races in the Third World. They still had their empires. This is a real basis for cooperation that Hitler could have exploited. And then, of course, the other great thing that he had in common with the Western powers was anti-communism. The Western powers, again, hated communism every bit as much as Hitler hated communism. This is another crucial piece of common ground which they could easily have worked on in diplomacy in order to create a common front against Bolshevism, which would have involved the Germans, the Brits, the French primarily. America might have been less bothered because they've got a whole ocean in between them. But they would have been on side too, right? Everybody hated the commies. Everybody hated the Bolsheviks. But Hitler thought he was going to do everything on his own, and that was insane, right? That was delusional. Of course, if you try to take on the whole world on your own, in the end you're going to lose, and it's going to be a catastrophic bloodbath, as indeed, as we all know, it was. So, of course, again, the policy vis-a-vis countries like the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia and Poland, terrible. He could have brought the Poles and the Czechs into a, pan-Aryan alliance against Bolshevism. The Poles were more afraid of the Russians than they were of the Germans in the 1930s, right? Everybody hated the bloody Russians, and not for no reason. That could have been the basis for a real alliance with the right diplomacy, but Hitler fucked it up, didn't he? So this is really important. You might agree with Hitler on some fundamental things. You might admire some things about him, but you cannot refuse to face up to how serious and bad his errors were. So clearly Hitler's terrible foreign policy decisions were connected to his underestimation of the Slavs, which was the first of my 4 points. Now, from here, I would like to talk about Hitler's profile, and this brings us to the DNA, right? apparently the DNA is going to bring forth evidence which will make it very highly probable that Hitler was autistic. I have not doubted this. I have known that Hitler was autistic for quite a while. This does not come as a shock to me. I mean, there's some clever girl on TikTok came out with the line that she's not autistic, she only has all the symptoms, right? It's kind of like that with Hitler. Hitler was socially awkward. He never managed to hold a steady job or adapt to institutions, right? He had intense fixations, whether it was art or architecture or politics, obsessive interests. His thinking was rigidly honest and radical, right? Which is something that normies really struggle with autistic people, because normies don't really care about logic or honesty, do they? They care much more about what's socially acceptable, right? They think that they don't care if your logic is sound. If you're saying something socially unacceptable, that's horrifying to them, right? But Hitler's thinking was radically honest, right, and radical. He had, of course, difficulty with interpersonal relationships. He subjected people to monologues, which people refer to as info dumping with respect to autism, right? So in his bohemian sort of Vienna years, he would hang around coffee shops looking for people to info dump on about his political takes. He had low empathy, I think. I'm pretty sure we can say that without very much controversy. Of course, nowadays when you talk about low empathy in connection with autism, you get the midwit blue hair female autist brigade who think that autism is completely compatible with hyper empathy. But the point is that our empathy is different, okay? If autists, or insofar as autists have empathy, it's very often cognitive empathy, which means that they are smart enough in some cases to see things from the normie point of view, right? To understand how they might feel cognitively. Our empathy, insofar as we have it, ain't normie empathy is the real point. And again, Hitler was capable of a sort of clear-sighted ruthlessness, which normies are horrified by, right? So there's that. And then, of course, there are his meltdowns, right? His meltdowns are notorious. People like to call them crash outs now, don't they? The Zoomers call them crash outs. Joshua Bloch is always crashing out about putting the fries in the bag, right? Well, of course, Hitler had even more notorious crash outs than Joshua Bloch. You remember the famous Federline? Federline! Federline! You remember that crash out? Bruno Ganz, the actor in Downfall, performed it, and people used to put fake subtitles under it to make it funny, right? So yeah, Hitler had notorious crash outs. So yeah, if you don't think that Hitler was autistic, you're probably wrong. He only had all the symptoms. So yeah, the DNA does seem to confirm that suspicion that Hitler was autistic. And of course, he was autistic in the 1920s, guys. Right? It was tough enough being autistic in the late 20th century, never mind the fucking 1920s. And of course, Hitler suffered a lot, right? He couldn't fit in, couldn't adapt to institutions, slept in flop houses, and until the post-war period, he just couldn't find a place in society. So I think it's necessary to have some empathy for the young Hitler. Of course, a lot of autistic people hate the idea that Hitler is autistic because they think it tends to demonize. autism. Of course, that's silly. It really just displays ideological conformism on their part. Another thing about the DNA is that it seems to make it very likely that Hitler suffered from bipolar disorder. That makes a hell of a lot of sense too, because of course he does seem to have suffered from mania and also from depression. So the thing about that is that it seriously clouds your judgment, right? So when Hitler was in like a manic phase, everything would seem, more optimistic than it was, right? Think like somebody's going to save Paulus's army. Nobody knows who, but Hitler had no doubt that Paulus's army is going to be saved, so he wouldn't allow a retreat, right? Somebody's bound to save Paulus's army. Nobody saved the fucking army, right? And so Hitler made incredibly devastating errors of judgment, likely connected to, mania, phases of mania. But then, of course, comes the crash, right? And in the depressive phases, Hitler could also make devastatingly bad judgments. So I remember in the war, when things looked bad, Hitler would generally get into this extremely black mood in which he'd blame the Aryan race, right? He'd blame the Germanic people, the German people, for having failed to stand up for itself. If the German people fails, then, the white race is doomed, and it's on them. It's on them if they fail, right? We're still social Darwinists here, according in Hitler's time. So, yeah, if the white race goes down, it just proves that the white race wasn't strong enough to survive, and that's that, right? And so Hitler would get into that mindset when, things looked black, right? What else have we got? Yeah, so the point is that we have much better science now in the 21st century than they had at the time, with respect to autism, with respect to bipolar disorder, with respect to race, right? Our race science is radically advanced relative to the National Socialist period, in spite of the fact that liberal democracy is hysterical about it, such that, they try to hold it back, in fact. Same with the science on autism and bipolar disorder. So Hitler today could have been much better managed, right? So his talents, of which he clearly had very many, he had, focus, he had insight, he had unsentimental, the unsentimental ability to face things that the normies couldn't face, right? He has all of these talents, creative talents, because let's admit that he was incredibly successful. He is one of the people who contributed to the creation of a political philosophy which is still our shadow, right? Which is still the shadow of liberal democracy, which is, the thing that liberal democracy dreads more than anything else. Hitler was one of the people who contributed to the creation of that political philosophy. So, I mean, there's little doubt that he is a massively talented and creative person. So yeah, today his talents could have been much better managed, and his deficits could have been much reduced and much better managed too. So then the Kalman syndrome stuff, right? So people have been you've seen all the memes about this, right? Hitler had a micropenis, he had an undescended testicle, because he likely had Kalman syndrome. Don't know if this is true, maybe it is. If it is, it's mainly tabloid stuff. It's much less important than the other things that I've been saying here, right? It's much less important than the fact that he was autistic, much less important than the fact that he was bipolar. I'm not saying that it's psychologically insignificant, but I'm certainly saying that it's psychologically less significant than his autism or his bipolarity. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of trashy the takes that are going around about micropenises and things. Not very interesting, not very serious. Then let's talk about the drugs. This is the other point. So Morel was Hitler's doctor. And from 1941, from around the time of Barbarossa, Morel was pumping Hitler with an absolutely insane cocktail of drugs, right? Amphetamines, opiates, cocaine, Eucodal. And no doubt these drugs made the situation massively worse than it would otherwise have been, because you've already got Hitler's autism, you've already got his bipolarity, and those things the deficits of those things are being massively boosted, especially the bad judgment, which I think comes from largely the bipolar, highs and lows. That bad judgment is being massively intensified by by drugs. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is a very early period in experimentation with these drugs. They don't really know fully, to the extent that we do today, again, just how negative the impact of drugs like this are. They gave them out fairly casually, you know. They gave people amphetamines fairly casually, cocaine fairly casually. You remember, Freud in the 1930s and even 20s, and perhaps earlier than that, actually. Yeah, earlier than that. He was taking cocaine kind of casually, just for, you know, a bit of a boost. And the fact that these drugs can cloud your judgment was not really fully taken into account. So obviously that is a really important fact. So remember, through the 1930s, there was no final solution. People love to try to argue that National Socialism was an inherently murderous ideology, such that, you know, the mass murder, the genocide of the Jews was baked into National Socialism as a political philosophy. That runs into the simple fact that all the way through the 1930s, there was no attempt at genocide. And in fact, there were repeated attempts to resolve the Jewish question without any genocide, right? So it's pretty clear, in fact, that the Holocaust was a policy, not a matter of doctrine, such that you could have a National Socialist regime without genocide, right? The National Socialists repeatedly tried to find solutions to the Jewish question, including, of course, through Zionism, which did not involve mass murder, right? So the fact that Hitler, in 1942, when the decision was made at the Wannsee Conference, to press ahead with the final solution, the fact that by that time he was off his fucking face on an insane cocktail of drugs, you know, a cocktail of drugs that would put Motley Crue to shame, that fact is super relevant to the Holocaust, right? So you could argue that Morell, Hitler's doctor, bears responsibility for the Holocaust because, yeah, he put in place a regimen that massively deranged Hitler's judgment. So there's that interesting point to bear in mind. Yeah. So the idea was, of course, by this time Hitler's under massive stress because the errors that I talked about at the beginning, the error concerning the underestimation of the Slavs, that is taking effect now, right? Hitler, he's losing the war by 42, and so he's beginning to think, holy shit, I might have fucked up here. If I'm going down, I'm taking the Jews down with me. And of course, war has this horrible tendency to cheapen the value of human life, right? Human life seems a hell of a lot cheaper when people are dying left, right and centre. War is brutalising, and tragically we're seeing that in Ukraine, right? Russian and Ukrainian men are being brutalised in that conflict. White men killing white men again, which is just, it should never have happened. And again, bad diplomacy is at the core of that as well. Bad Western diplomacy, right? The West had 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, to foster a good relationship with the other white countries, with Russia in particular. And they fucked up, didn't they? They failed. And it went to such a point that Russia had to resort to war, which is devastating for everybody concerned. Millions of Russians dying. They had to resort to war to put their foot down and draw a line against NATO expansionism. So, yeah, there are really interesting parallels with Western policy now and Western policy in the first half of the 20th century. So, that's right. Okay, so now the really important point that I want to make about Hitler's terrible judgments, his judgment with respect to underestimating the Slavs, his judgment with respect to bad diplomacy vis-a-vis the Western powers, including Poland, his bad judgment with respect to invading Russia in Barbarossa, his bad judgment in particular cases with respect to strategy, like failing to allow Paulus to retreat, for instance, from Stalingrad. All of these policies, and especially more than anything else, the Holocaust and the T4 program, the euthanasia program, these policies have had the devastating impact of ruining ethno-nationalism for white people, right? Because ethno-nationalism for white people in our time is almost inevitably associated with these catastrophic policies. These catastrophic policies, I suggest, were all down to Hitler's deficits, which were mismanaged, and the fact that Morel actually deepened those deficits with his drug regime. So the fact that Hitler made such devastating policies has had a dreadful impact on the health of white people today. We're hardly capable of having a positive, collective identity nowadays. We're incapable, more or less committing racial suicide because we have the idea that any, pride, any ethnic identity, any ethnic consciousness on our part leads straight to bloody Auschwitz, right? This is a major catastrophe because, as I say, we're pretty much committing racial suicide as a result of this idea. And so what I would like to say is that just because Hitler made some catastrophic errors does not invalidate National Socialism as a political philosophy. I would like to suggest that ethno-nationalism is actually equivalent to National Socialism, right? So the proposition X is an ethno-nationalist implies X is a National Socialist, is analytic, right? It's like X is a bachelor implies X is an unmarried man. You can pretty much substitute the word ethnic for the word national, and you can pretty much substitute the nationalist part in ethno-nationalist for socialist, because all we're talking about there is ethnic solidarity, right? The solidarity of the race or ethnic nation. So you can't really be an ethno-nationalist without being a National Socialist, and that's a question of logic so far as I'm concerned. And so it is going to be really important for us to separate doctrine from policy, to separate National Socialism, core political philosophy, from the errors of Hitler. So there are two errors that have to be avoided. One of them is thinking that if we're going to be National Socialists, we have to apologise for and support everything that Hitler ever did or said. We don't, because Hitler had some unmanaged deficits and he had a terrible drug regime which massively clouded his judgment, and he made some absolutely catastrophic errors which we must not apologise for. We must admit that they're errors, and we must distinguish National Socialism qua political philosophy from National Socialism qua historical regime. Just distinguish doctrine and policy, which are nice, clear things, right? Nice, clear, distinct things. So it is one error to think that if we're going to be National Socialists, we have to accept everything, agree with everything that Hitler ever said or did. The other error is thinking that because of what happened in the Second World War, we have to completely renounce any race realism or ethno-nationalism, because race is real. It's established scientific fact that race is real. Our race science today is much better and more advanced than it was in Hitler's time. We understand race better now than people did then. And we can see that multiculturalism and the denial of race, right? Denialism about race has led to absolutely catastrophic consequences for the West today, right? So there is no more important political task in our time than that one of separating doctrine from policy, separating National Socialism, core political philosophy, from the regime of Hitler and its catastrophic errors. So enjoy the documentary this evening.